My ex-girlfriend's mother called me 10 months after our breakup and asked if I could fix her fence. I should have said no. Instead, I said yes, and by the end of that first afternoon, I understood exactly why my ex once told me I was too settled. What I didn't expect was that her own mother would be the one to finally make me feel like settled wasn't a flaw at all. When my ex's mother called and asked if I still knew how to fix a fence, I should have said no. Not because I couldn't. I could fix a fence. I could fix a gate, a porch step, a leaking hose bib, a loose cabinet hinge, and half the things people ignored until they became expensive. What I could not fix was the strange feeling I got when I saw her name on my phone after 10 months of silence. Renee Whitfield, my ex-girlfriend's mother? The woman who used to hand me coffee when I came over too early to help Sydney move furniture she had bought without measuring the hallway. The woman who noticed when I was tired before Sydney did. The woman who once told me quietly while Sydney was upstairs getting ready for dinner, "You're a good man, Grant. Don't let anyone make that feel small." I had thought about that sentence more times than I should have. My name is Grant Ashby. I was 34, a project supervisor for a small home renovation company outside Asheville, and I had spent most of the past year learning that being easy to count on did not mean people would count you correctly. Sydney and I had dated for almost 3 years. It ended on a Sunday afternoon in her apartment with two half-packed suitcases, a cold coffee on the counter, and her saying, "I don't think this is going anywhere." I remember looking around at the shelves I had installed for her, the dining table I had assembled, the framed print I had helped her hang after she changed her mind 3 times about the height. "Going where?" I asked. She sighed like the question proved her point. "I don't know, Grant. Somewhere. You're sweet, but everything with you feels so settled." Settled. She said it like a diagnosis. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I didn't perform some dramatic last stand. I packed the tools I had left under her sink, carried them to my truck, and drove home with the radio off. 2 months later, I heard she moved to Atlanta for a marketing job. 4 months later, a mutual friend told me she was seeing a guy who owned 2 motorcycles and called himself a founder because he had ordered business cards. Good for her, I guess. I meant that on better days. On worse ones, I hoped his motorcycles leaked. Renee had not called after the breakup. I understood why. Her daughter was her daughter. There were lines decent people did not cross just because affection had gotten complicated. So when my phone lit up with her name on a humid Thursday morning, I stared at it long enough for the call to almost die. Then I answered. "Mrs. Whitfield?" A pause. Then her voice, warm but careful. "Grant, hi. I'm sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me." That came out too quickly. She heard it. Of course she did. Renee always heard the second sentence under the first one. "I wouldn't ask if I had another good option," she said. "The storm last night knocked part of my back fence loose. The gate won't latch. I called 2 companies, but one can't come until next week, and the other quoted me something ridiculous." I looked at the schedule board in the job trailer. We had an inspection delayed until Monday and a cabinet delivery pushed back by rain. "I can take a look after work," I said. "You don't have to." "I know." Another pause, then softer. "Thank you." I told myself it was just a fence. That was all. A broken fence, a woman who needed help, and a man who knew how to use a level. Nothing dangerous, nothing complicated, nothing that should have made me change shirts twice before driving over. Renee's house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with old trees and lawns people took personally. I had been there dozens of times when Sydney and I were together. Cookouts, birthdays, Christmas Eve once when Sydney forgot to tell me her entire family dressed nicely and I showed up in jeans. Renee had saved me that night by saying, "At least one man here looks useful." I remember that, too. When I pulled into the driveway, the first thing I saw was the fence leaning behind the house. One section pulled loose from the post, the gate sagging like it had given up on citizenship. The second thing I saw was Renee. She stood near the back porch in a pale blue blouse, jeans, and gardening gloves, her brown hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck. She was in her late 40s, maybe 50, though she carried age the way some women carry perfume, quietly with confidence, not asking permission to still be beautiful. I got out of the truck and immediately hated that I noticed. "Renee," she said. "Mrs. Whitfield." Her mouth tilted. "You can call me Renee. I think after all the shelves you installed in this house, we've earned first names." "Renee," I corrected. The name felt different in my mouth. She looked away first, toward the fence. Good, the fence was safer. I grabbed my tool bag from the truck and followed her around back. The yard smelled like wet cedar and cut grass. A wind chime moved softly near the porch. 2 coffee mugs sat on the small outdoor table, though only one had been used. I tried to brace it, she said, pointing to a board she had wedged near the post. I crouched beside it. This actually helped. You don't have to sound surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm impressed. She folded her arms. That may be worse. I smiled before I could stop myself. For a second, it was too easy. That was the problem. Renee didn't make the air feel like a test. With Sydney, I had always been trying to become interesting enough, ambitious enough, spontaneous enough, less predictable, less quiet, less myself. With Renee, the quiet didn't feel like failure. It just felt like quiet. I worked for half an hour while she cleaned up branches near the garden. Every few minutes, she brought me something I didn't ask for. A towel, a bottle of water, a better extension cord. Not hovering, not fussing, just noticing. At one point, I caught her watching me tighten the hinge bolts. She looked away quickly. I pretended not to see. That was the decent thing. Or maybe the cowardly thing. Hard to tell sometimes. "You've been well?" she asked. I kept my eyes on the latch. "Mostly." "That means no." "That means mostly." She laughed softly. I looked up. Bad idea. She was standing close enough now that I could see the faint sun lines near her eyes, the flower-colored smudge of paint on one wrist, the way her expression softened when she wasn't guarding it. "I heard Sydney moved," I said, because apparently I wanted to ruin my own afternoon. Renee's face changed just a little. "Yes, Atlanta." "How's she doing?" "She's Sydney," Renee said. That answer carried more than it said. I stood and wiped my hands on a rag. "That bad?" "No, not bad." She looked toward the fence. "She's chasing what she thinks she wants." "And what's that?" Renee's eyes came back to mine. Something that never asked her to sit still enough to know herself. The words landed quietly. Too quietly. I looked down first. The gate swung better now, but the latch still needed adjusting. I needed another 20 minutes, maybe 30 if I worked slowly, which I was trying not to admit I wanted to do. Renee stepped onto the porch and pulled off her gloves. "Finish the fence and I'll make lunch." I froze with one hand on the latch. Not because the sentence was improper, it wasn't. It was simple, domestic, almost innocent. But something about the way she said it, not flirtatious exactly, not bold, not careless, made the whole yard feel warmer. Like she wasn't only offering food, like she was asking me to stay a little longer. I turned toward her. She held my gaze for half a second too long. Then she looked down at the gloves in her hand. "You don't have to," she added. There it was, the line decent people draw after saying something they maybe meant too much. I should have said I had another job. I should have packed up after the latch worked and driven away with the radio on. Instead, I looked at the cricket gate, then back at her. "I can finish it," I said. Renee nodded once, and the small smile she tried to hide was the first thing that made me wonder if the fence was the only thing broken enough to bring me back there. Lunch should not have felt intimate. It was a sandwich. Turkey, tomato, sharp cheddar, toasted bread, mustard on the side because Renee remembered I didn't like it spread too thick. That detail bothered me more than it should have. Not because it was romantic, because it was remembered. Sydney used to forget small things and then call them small because that made forgetting them less expensive. Renee remembered them quietly without making a speech out of it. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink while she moved around behind me, opening cabinets, setting plates on the counter, pouring iced tea into 2 glasses. The house looked almost the same as it had when Sydney and I were together. Same yellow curtains over the window, same ceramic bowl near the door where everyone dropped keys, same old radio on the shelf above the stove. But without Sydney's constant motion, the place felt different. Still, not empty, just honest. "You didn't have to make anything," I said. "I know. That's becoming your favorite answer." She smiled at the cutting board. "Maybe I learned it from someone." I dried my hands on the towel beside the sink. "From me? You were always very good at helping without making a ceremony out of it." That stopped me. Renee kept slicing tomato like she hadn't said anything dangerous. I leaned back against the counter. Sydney used to call that boring. Her knife paused just once. Then she continued. Sydney called a lot of things boring before she understood them. There it was again. that quiet way Renee had of saying something gentle and devastating at the same time. I should have let it pass. Instead, I asked, "Did she talk about me after we broke up?" Renee set the knife down, not dramatically, carefully. Yes, that was all. Enough to make my stomach tighten. I looked toward the back window, where the repaired gate stood almost straight now. What did she say? Renee turned to face me. "Grant, that bad?" "No, not bad in the way you mean." "Then how?" She seemed to choose each word before letting it go. "She said you were kind, reliable, safe." A small sadness moved through her expression, but she said those words like they were reasons to leave. I looked down. That hurt. Not because I hadn't suspected it, because hearing it from Renee made it impossible to pretend I had misunderstood. "She wanted more," I said. Renee's voice softened. "She wanted louder." That sentence went through me clean. I didn't answer. She stepped closer to the counter, close enough to reach past me for the glasses, not touching me, not even almost, but close enough that I noticed the scent of soap on her skin, and lemon from the cutting board. My mind said, Sydney's mother. My body, traitor that it was, noticed she was a woman standing close to me in a quiet kitchen. I moved aside too quickly. Renee noticed. Of course she did. A faint flush touched her face. "Sorry. You didn't do anything." "I know." She looked at the plates. Still. That was the strange thing between us. Neither of us had done anything wrong, but the air kept behaving like we had approached something we were not supposed to name. We ate at the small table near the window, not the dining room. That mattered. The dining room belonged to old family dinners, holidays, Sydney laughing too loudly while I helped clear plates. The kitchen table felt different, less formal, more dangerous because it was ordinary. For a while we talked about safe things, the storm, the neighborhood, work. She asked about the renovation company, and I told her about a house we were restoring on the east side, an old craftsman place with good bones and terrible plumbing. Her eyes lit up when I described the original woodwork. "You always liked fixing what other people wanted to replace," she said. I smiled faintly. Sometimes replacement is easier. Easier isn't always better. No. We both heard the other meaning. Neither of us touched it. Halfway through lunch, her phone rang on the counter. Renee glanced at the screen. Her expression changed. Not fear, not guilt. Complication. "Sydney?" I asked. Renee nodded. "You can answer." "I know." She didn't. The phone stopped, then immediately started again. This time, Renee sighed and picked it up. "Hi, honey." I looked out the window, trying to give her privacy in a room too small for it. Sydney's voice came through faintly, sharp and bright even without speaker. "Did someone fix the fence?" Renee's eyes flicked to me. Grant came by. A pause, then Sydney laughed, not warmly. "Mom, seriously?" Renee's face went still. "What? You called Grant? That's weird." I stared at the table. Renee lowered her voice. He knew how to fix it." "Of course he did. That's his whole thing." Something in my chest tightened. Sydney continued, muffled but clear enough. "He loves being needed. Just don't let him hang around and get sentimental." Renee closed her eyes. For a second, I felt like I had been put back in Sydney's apartment on the day she left, listening to her reduce 3 years of love into something too settled to keep. Then Renee said very calmly, "Sydney, that was unkind." Another pause. "Oh my God, Mom, don't make it dramatic." Renee looked at me then, and maybe it was the fact that she didn't look embarrassed for herself. She looked sorry for me. That was worse. "I'll call you later," she said. She hung up before Sydney could answer. The kitchen became very quiet. I pushed my chair back. "I should go." Renee stood too. "Grant, it's fine." "No, it isn't." I stopped near the back door. She came closer, but not too close this time. "That is not how I see you," she said. I looked at her. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "You know that, right?" I wanted to say yes. I didn't, because suddenly I wasn't sure how many years I had spent letting Sydney's version of me become the version I carried around. Useful, settled, safe, needed. Words that should have been good until she made them sound like furniture. Renee's face softened. "Sydney called you boring because she didn't know what peace looked like." I laughed once, but it almost hurt. "Don't say things like that." "Why?" "Because I might believe you." The moment changed, just like that. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the space between us narrowed, even though neither of us moved. Renee's hand rested on the back of the kitchen chair. Mine was still on the doorframe. We were 10 feet apart and somehow too close. She looked away first. I shouldn't have said that. No, I said. You probably should have said it a long time ago. Her eyes came back to mine. There were a dozen reasons not to keep looking at her. I knew every one of them. Sydney, history, age, the shape of gossip, the fact that Renee had once been almost family in a way that made this whole afternoon feel like stepping over an invisible line. But there was also this. For the first time in almost a year, I felt seen without being measured and found lacking. I opened the door. Outside, the yard was bright after the rain, the repaired gate catching sunlight along the new screws. Renee followed me onto the porch. I still need to stain that replacement board, I said. You don't have to. I know. She smiled faintly. There it is again. I can come back Saturday. The words came out before I gave them permission. Renee looked at the fence, then at me. That would help, she said. It was the safest answer. It was also not the whole answer. I walked to my truck, opened the door, and glanced back once. Renee was still on the porch, one hand resting against the railing, watching me leave like she wanted to say something and too decent to let herself. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Sydney. Mom told me you came over. Please don't make this strange. I looked from the message to Renee on the porch, and for the first time since the breakup, I didn't feel like I owed Sydney the smallest version of myself. I went back Saturday. That was the first decision I could not dress up as obligation. The fence was fixed enough, the gate latched, the post held. The replacement board needed stain, yes, but that was the kind of detail a man could leave unfinished if he was trying to be wise. I was not trying very hard. Renee was in the backyard when I arrived, kneeling beside a flower bed with a basket of weeds and her hair pulled back under a wide straw hat. She looked up when she heard my truck. For half a second, her face lit before she remembered to be careful. Then she stood, brushing dirt from her jeans. You came? I said I would. I know. She looked toward the fence. People say things. Some do. That made her smile, but it faded quickly. There was tension in the yard that had not been there before. Not the soft, strange tension from the kitchen. This was sharper, aware, like both of us had spent the past 2 days thinking about the same moment and arriving at it from opposite sides. I grabbed the stain and brushes from the truck. Renee took off her gardening gloves. I made coffee. Is that part of the payment plan? No, the sandwich was payment. Coffee is bribery. For what? She looked at the fence, then at me. For not leaving immediately after the board dries. I should have laughed. I almost did, but her voice had too much honesty under it. So I said, it depends how good the coffee is. She held my gaze. It's better than Sydney's. That surprised both of us. Renee looked away first, color rising lightly in her cheeks. I shouldn't compare. No, I said, opening the stain can. But you're not wrong. For the next hour, I worked on the fence while she moved around the yard, deadheading roses, carrying clippings, pretending to stay busy. Every few minutes, we found reasons to speak. She asked about a porch restoration I was supervising. I asked about the garden. She told me the hydrangeas were dramatic and unforgiving. I said that sounded familiar. She laughed, then tried not to. That's how the whole morning went. Laughter pulled back just before it became too easy. At one point, she stepped close to hand me a clean rag. The wind shifted the brim of her hat, and I reached up without thinking, catching it before it blew off. My hand brushed the side of her hair, barely. Renee froze. So did I. Her eyes lifted to mine, and for one breath, the whole yard dropped away. No fence, no stain, no old history, just her standing close enough for me to see the small flecks of green in her hazel eyes, and me realizing I had not felt that awake in a long time. Then she stepped back. Thank you, she said. For the hat? For not pretending that didn't happen. I set the rag down slowly. I don't know what happened. Yes, you do. The honesty in that answer was almost cruel. I turned back to the fence because wood and stain were safer than Renee Whitfield with sunlight on her face. When the last board was done, she poured coffee on the porch. We sat in 2 old chairs angled toward the yard, close enough to talk easily, far enough to look respectable from the street. Respectable. That word was starting to feel like a fence of its own. Renee held her coffee mug with both hands. Sydney called me again. I figured. She thinks I'm being foolish. I looked at her. For hiring me?
for inviting me back." The porch went quiet. Renee stared into her coffee. She said people will talk. Will they? Probably. I leaned back. Then let's not give them anything true. She looked at me quickly. I regretted how that sounded the second I said it. I didn't mean, I know what you meant. No, I'm not sure I did. Her expression softened, but there was sadness in it. Grant, I need to say something clearly before this becomes something we hide inside jokes and coffee. I set my mug down. She took a breath. I cared about you when you were with Sydney, but not like this. Her voice stayed steady, though her fingers tightened around the cup. Not in a way I allowed myself to look at. You were kind to my daughter. You were good in my house. You fixed things without making people feel useless. And I noticed because I was her mother, and because I'm a person who notices. I didn't move. After you two ended, she continued, I missed you. That embarrassed me. I told myself I missed the help or the company or the way the house felt less empty when someone steady was in it. She looked at me then, but that wasn't all of it. My throat felt tight. Renee, I'm not asking you for anything. I know. I'm serious. Her eyes held mine. I will not be a foolish woman chasing her daughter's ex because she's lonely. That's not what I think this is. What do you think it is? There were careful answers, safe answers, answers that would let both of us step back onto familiar ground. But I was tired of being reduced to the safest version of myself. I think, I said slowly, Sydney left because she thought peace was boring, and I think sitting here with you feels like being understood by someone who knows the difference. Renee's eyes filled, but she didn't look away.
That was the moment the back gate clicked. Both of us turned. Sydney stepped into the yard, not alone. A man I didn't know stood behind her, sunglasses pushed up on his head, one hand resting casually on the gate I had fixed. Sydney looked from me to her mother, then to the two coffee mugs on the porch. Her face changed. Not hurt, not really, more like offended that part of her path had started moving without permission. Well, she said, smiling in a way I recognized too well, this is cozy. Renee stood. Sydney. I stood too, slower. Sydney's eyes moved over my work clothes, the stained brush, the fence, then back to her mother. So this is why you needed the fence fixed twice? The man behind her shifted awkwardly. Renee's voice was calm. Don't do that. Do what? Make something ugly because you don't know how to respect something uncomfortable. Sydney laughed once. Mom, he's my ex. I know who he is. The words landed harder than they should have. Sydney looked at me then, finally. You're seriously having coffee with my mother? I could have defended myself. I could have apologized. I could have stepped back into the old role where Sydney named the room and I tried to make it easier for her. Instead, I looked at Renee. She was pale, but steady. Then I looked back at Sydney. Yes, I said, I am. The yard went silent, and for the first time since I had known her, Sydney looked at me like she had expected me to shrink and found someone else standing there instead. Sydney stared at me like the word yes had come from the wrong mouth. For years, I had been predictable to her, useful, gentle, the man who carried boxes, fixed hinges, paid attention, and made discomfort easier for everyone else. Apparently, I had also been expected to stay that way after she left. Renee stood near the porch railing, one hand still wrapped around her coffee mug, her face pale but steady. Sydney's boyfriend cleared his throat near the gate. Maybe we should... Blake, Sydney said without looking at him. Don't. So that was his name. Blake looked exactly like the kind of man Sydney would choose after calling me settled. Sunglasses in his hair, expensive sneakers, a shirt open one button too many for a backyard. He gave me a quick look, then looked away. Smartest thing he did all morning. Sydney crossed her arms. This is inappropriate. Renee set the mug down. Having coffee on my own porch? With Grant. With a man who fixed my fence. Sydney laughed, sharp and embarrassed. Mom, don't play dumb. Renee's expression changed at that. Not anger, worse, disappointment. I am not playing anything. The yard went very still. I could hear the wind moving through the leaves behind the fence, the small click of the gate latch, the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. Sydney looked at me again. And you? What exactly are you doing here? I wiped my hands on the rag slowly. I stained the replacement board. Right, because you're just that helpful. There it was, the old tone, the one that made kindness sound suspicious, like every decent thing I did was secretly a symptom of lacking ambition.
I felt it hit, but it didn't sink in the way it used to. Maybe because Renee was standing there. Maybe because she had already said the sentence I needed to hear. She called you boring because she didn't know what peace looked like. I looked at Sydney and said, "You asked me not to make this strange." Her mouth tightened. "I didn't." "You did." Blake shifted behind her. "Sydney, maybe we should go." This time she turned on him. I said, "Don't." Renee stepped off the porch then, carefully, like a woman walking into a room full of glass. "Sydney," she said, "you ended the relationship." Sydney's face flushed. "That doesn't mean I want my mother making coffee for him like some lonely divorcee in a bad movie." The words landed hard. Renee inhaled once. I stepped forward before I could stop myself. "Don't do that." Sydney's eyes snapped at mine. Renee said softly, "Grant," but I was already there. Not yelling, not performing, just done. You don't get to leave people behind and still decide what they're allowed to mean to each other. Sydney stared at me. I think that was the moment she realized this was not about winning me back. That would have been easier for her to understand. This was worse. This was me no longer asking her permission to be seen differently. Her voice dropped. "You're seriously defending my mother against me?" "No," I said. "I'm defending a person standing in her own yard." Renee looked down. Sydney blinked fast, like the humiliation was finally becoming real because it hadn't obeyed her. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then she said, "Wow, I guess I was right. You really do need to be needed." Renee's head lifted. "Enough," she said. "One word, quiet. Absolute." Sydney froze. Renee walked down the porch steps then, carefully, like a woman walking into a room full of glass. "Sydney," she said, "you ended the relationship." Sydney's face flushed. "That doesn't mean I want my mother making coffee for him like some lonely divorcee in a bad movie." The words landed hard. Renee inhaled once. I stepped forward before I could stop myself. "Don't do that." Sydney's eyes snapped at mine. Renee said softly, "Grant," but I was already there. Not yelling, not performing, just done. You don't get to leave people behind and still decide what they're allowed to mean to each other. Sydney stared at me. I think that was the moment she realized this was not about winning me back. That would have been easier for her to understand. This was worse. This was me no longer asking her permission to be seen differently. Her voice dropped. "You're seriously defending my mother against me?" "No," I said. "I'm defending a person standing in her own yard." Renee looked down. Sydney blinked fast, like the humiliation was finally becoming real because it hadn't obeyed her. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then she said, "Wow, I guess I was right. You really do need to be needed." Renee's head lifted. "Enough," she said. "One word, quiet. Absolute." Sydney froze. Renee walked down the porch steps then, carefully, like a woman walking into a room full of glass. "Sydney," she said, "you ended the relationship." Sydney's face flushed. "That doesn't mean I want my mother making coffee for him like some lonely divorcee in a bad movie." The words landed hard. Renee inhaled once. I stepped forward before I could stop myself. "Don't do that." Sydney's eyes snapped at mine. Renee said softly, "Grant," but I was already there. Not yelling, not performing, just done. You don't get to leave people behind and still decide what they're allowed to mean to each other. Sydney stared at me. I think that was the moment she realized this was not about winning me back. That would have been easier for her to understand. This was worse. This was me no longer asking her permission to be seen differently. Her voice dropped. "You're seriously defending my mother against me?" "No," I said. "I'm defending a person standing in her own yard." Renee looked down. Sydney blinked fast, like the humiliation was finally becoming real because it hadn't obeyed her. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then she said, "Wow, I guess I was right. You really do need to be needed." Renee's head lifted. "Enough," she said. "One word, quiet. Absolute." Sydney froze. Renee walked down the porch steps then, carefully, like a woman walking into a room full of glass. "Sydney," she said, "you ended the relationship." Sydney's face flushed. "That doesn't mean I want my mother making coffee for him like some lonely divorcee in a bad movie." The words landed hard. Renee inhaled once. I stepped forward before I could stop myself. "Don't do that." Sydney's eyes snapped at mine. Renee said softly, "Grant, but I was already there. Not yelling, not performing, just done. You don't get to leave people behind and still decide what they're allowed to mean to each other." Sydney stared at me. I think that was the moment she realized this was not about winning me back. That would have been easier for her to understand. This was worse. This was me no longer asking her permission to be seen differently. Her voice dropped. "You're seriously defending my mother against me?" "No," I said. "I'm defending a person standing in her own yard." Renee looked down. Sydney blinked fast, like the humiliation was finally becoming real because it hadn't obeyed her. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then she said, "Wow, I guess I was right. You really do need to be needed." Renee's head lifted. "Enough," she said. One word, quiet. Absolute. Sydney froze. Renee walked down the porch steps then, carefully, like a woman walking into a room full of glass. "Sydney," she said, "you ended the relationship." Sydney's face flushed. "That doesn't mean I want my mother making coffee for him like some lonely divorcee in a bad movie." The words landed hard. Renee inhaled once. I stepped forward before I could stop myself. "Don't do that." Sydney's eyes snapped at mine. Renee said softly, "Grant, but I was already there. Not yelling, not performing, just done. You don't get to leave people behind and still decide what they're allowed to mean to each other." Sydney stared at me. I think that was the moment she realized this was not about winning me back. That would have been easier for her to understand. This was worse. This was me no longer asking her permission to be seen differently. Her voice dropped. "You're seriously defending my mother against me?" "No," I said. "I'm defending a person standing in her own yard." Renee looked down. Sydney blinked fast, like the humiliation was finally becoming real because it hadn't obeyed her. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then she said, "Wow, I guess I was right. You really do need to be needed." Renee's head lifted. "Enough," she said. One word, quiet. Absolute. Sydney froze. Renee walked down the porch steps then, carefully, like a woman walking into a room full of glass. "Sydney," she said, "you ended the relationship." Sydney's face flushed. "That doesn't mean I want my mother making coffee for him like some lonely divorcee in a bad movie." The words landed hard. Renee inhaled once. I stepped forward before I could stop myself. "Don't talk to her like that." Sydney's eyes snapped to mine. Renee said softly, "Grant," but I was already there. Not yelling, not performing, just done. You don't get to leave people behind and still decide what they're allowed to mean to each other. Sydney stared at me. I think that was the moment she realized this was not about winning me back. That would have been easier for her to understand. This was worse. This was me no longer asking her permission to be seen differently. Her voice dropped. "You're seriously defending my mother against me?" "No," I said. "I'm defending a person standing in her own yard." Renee looked down. Sydney blinked fast, like the humiliation was finally becoming real because it hadn't obeyed her. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then she said, "Wow, I guess I was right. You really do need to be needed." Renee's head lifted. "Enough," she said. One word, quiet. Absolute. Sydney froze. Renee walked down the porch steps until she stood between us, not shielding me, not shielding Sydney, just claiming the center of her own life. "You don't have to like this," she said to her daughter. "You don't even have to understand it today, but you will not come into my home and use my loneliness as an insult." Sydney's eyes filled with angry tears. "I'm your daughter." "Yes," Renee said, "and I love you. But love does not give you ownership over everyone you've stopped valuing." That was a sentence that ended the fight. Sydney stared from her mother to me, then back again. For once, she had no clever dismissal ready. Blake opened the gate gently. "Come on." This time, she let him guide her out. At the gate, she stopped and looked back. "This is going to look terrible." Renee's voice was tired now. "Then maybe people should learn to look longer." Sydney left. The gate clicked shut behind her. For a while, neither of us moved. Then Renee turned away and walked into the kitchen. I stayed in the yard for maybe 10 seconds, staring at the boards I had stained, the clean line of the gate, the thing I had fixed while everything else came apart. Then I followed. Renee stood at the sink, gripping the counter with both hands. "I'm sorry," she said without turning. "For what?" "For putting you in that." "I didn't." "She's my daughter." "I know. And you're her ex. I know that too." She turned then. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "This cannot be something that happens because Sydney hurt your pride. It isn't. You need to be sure." "I am." "No." She stepped closer and the kitchen felt smaller than it had at lunch. "You need to be sure because if this is only about being seen after being dismissed, then I am not the woman you want. I am just the first person who handed back the part of you she made you doubt." That was the most Renee thing she could have said. Even now, even with her own heart shaking in front of me, she was still trying to protect me from mistaking gratitude for love. I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who remembered my coffee, who noticed silence, who defended herself without cruelty, who stood in her yard and refused to let her own daughter turn care into shame. "This started before today," I said. Her breath caught. "I don't mean when I was with Sydney. I would never have let myself see it then. I don't think you did either." "No," she whispered. "I didn't. But after?" I swallowed once. "After the breakup, I kept thinking about this house, your coffee, the way you talked to me, like quiet wasn't a defect. I told myself I missed being useful somewhere, but that wasn't all of it." Renee closed her eyes. "Grant, I don't want you because Sydney didn't." My voice came out rougher than I meant it to. "I want you because when I'm with you, I don't feel like I have to become louder just to be worth keeping." That broke her composure. Only a little. One tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. I took one step closer, slow enough that she could move away. She didn't. "We shouldn't rush this," she said. "No. People will talk. Yes. Sydney will hate it. For a while. Maybe longer. Maybe." Her mouth trembled into something almost like a smile. "You're not helping." "I'm trying not to lie." That did it. She laughed softly through the tears, and the sound went straight through me. Then her hand lifted, not to touch me, not at first, just hovering near my chest like she was asking permission from the air itself. I covered her hand with mine. The contact was simple, devastating. Renee looked at her hands. "This is the line," she whispered. "I know. If we cross it, we do it honestly." "I know. No hiding, no sneaking, no making it ugly." "I don't want ugly with you." Her eyes lifted to mine. For a long second, we stayed there, close enough to hear each other breathe, both of us old enough to know that wanting something did not automatically make it wise. Then she stepped back. Not because she didn't want me, because she did. "I need time," she said. I nodded, even though it hurt. "Then take it." I left her house without kissing her. That was the right thing. I hated how right it felt. But when I reached my truck, my phone buzzed. A message from Renee. "Thank you for not making me choose between desire and dignity." I stood there beside the truck reading it twice. Then a second message appeared. "But Grant, I did want you to kiss me." I looked back at the house. Renee was standing in the kitchen window, one hand against a curtain, watching me with a face of fear, warmth, and the truth neither of us could pretend had only started that morning. I didn't go inside. Not that day. I stood beside my truck with Renee's message glowing on my phone, the repaired fence behind her house, and the strange ache of knowing that sometimes doing the right thing feels almost cruel because the wrong thing would be easier for one perfect minute. "But Grant, I did want you to kiss me." I read it again. Then I looked toward the kitchen window. Renee was still there, not smiling, not pretending, just watching me with the same honesty that had made everything harder and cleaner at the same time. I typed back, "I know." Then, after a few seconds, "That's why I didn't." Her hand rose to her mouth behind the glass. I drove home before I became less decent than the man she believed I was. For 2 weeks, I didn't see her. We texted only once or twice. Practical things. The fence held through another storm. The stain dried evenly. She found the missing latch screw in the flower bed. Ordinary messages with entire rooms underneath them. Sydney texted me 3 times. The first one was angry. "I can't believe you're doing this." The second one came the next morning. "Are you actually interested in my mom, or are you just trying to make me feel bad?" That one, I answered. "This isn't about punishing you." She didn't reply for 2 days. Then came the third. "I don't know what to do with this." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I wrote, "You don't have to do anything today, but you don't get to make your mother ashamed for being seen." She didn't answer. That was probably best. Renee called me on a Thursday evening. I was sitting on my back steps, work boots still dusty, a plate of reheated leftovers balanced beside me. "Hi," she said. "Hi." A pause. Then she laughed softly. "We sounds ridiculous." "We are a little ridiculous." "Only a little?" I'm being generous. That helped. I could hear her breathing settle on the other end. "I talked to Sydney," she said. My hand tightened around the phone. "How was that?" "Hard." "Yeah." She was angry, then embarrassed, then angry again because embarrassment had nowhere else to go. Renee paused, but we talked. About me? Some. Mostly about her. That surprised me. Renee continued. "I told her I loved her. I told her that would never change. And then I told her she does not get to treat people as possessions after she has chosen to release them." I closed my eyes. That must have been difficult. It was. Her voice softened, but necessary. The next Saturday, Renee asked me to meet her for coffee. Not at her house, not mine. A small place downtown with bright windows, loud espresso machines, and no history attached to the chairs. She arrived before me, wearing a green dress and a denim jacket, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked nervous. That made me less nervous somehow. I sat across from her. No fence, no porch, no daughter walking through a gate, just us. "She needs to know something," she said. "Okay. If this happens, it cannot be because I made you feel valued after Sydney didn't. I've thought about that. And? And I think being valued is part of why I noticed you." I looked at her directly. "But it isn't why I want to keep noticing you." Her eyes softened. I continued because she deserved the whole answer. "I like how quiet feels around you. I like that you remember things without using them to prove anything. I like that you don't confuse steady with dull. I like the way you tell the truth gently, until someone needs it plain." I smiled a little. "And I like that your coffee is better than your daughter's." Renee looked down, smiling despite herself. That last part was the clincher? Obviously. We took it slowly after that. Painfully slowly. No hiding, no sneaking around, no pretending the situation was simple. Sydney needed time and Renee gave it to her without asking me to disappear. That mattered. I learned something about love watching Renee be both a mother and the woman refusing to amputate one part of herself to make the other more comfortable. A month later, Sydney asked me to meet me. We sat on a park bench near the river with 10 feet of emotional distance between us and no desire from either side to close it. "I was cruel to you," she said. I looked at her. She stared at the water. "I called you boring because I was scared of becoming ordinary, and you were the easiest person to blame because you never made me feel bad for leaving." That was more honesty than I expected. "Thank you for saying that," I said. She nodded, swallowing hard. Then she added, "I still hate this." "I know, but I don't think you're doing it to hurt me." "No, and I don't think Mom is lonely in the way I accused her of being." "No," I said, "and she isn't." Sydney laughed once, but it broke a little. "She looks happy." I didn't answer, not because it wasn't true, because I knew hearing it cost her something. 6 months later, Renee and I went to a neighborhood concert in the park and held hands in public for the first time. No announcement, no performance, just her fingers slipping into mine while a local band played badly under string lights, and neither of us letting go when 2 people looked over and recognized us. A year later, I moved into a small house 5 minutes from hers, not with her, near her. That was our compromise with time. I fixed my own porch. She planted lavender by the steps and claimed it was not symbolic. I let her lie. Eventually, Sydney came over for dinner. It was awkward, then less awkward. Then at one point, Renee burned the bread. I opened all the windows and Sydney laughed so hard she had to sit down. That was when I knew we might survive the strange shape of our lives. Not perfectly, but honestly. 2 years after the fence broke, I asked Renee to marry me in her backyard, near the gate that had started it all. The board I had replaced was still slightly different from the others. Lighter, newer, impossible to miss once you knew where to look. Renee touched it after I asked, smiling through tears. "This fence caused a lot of trouble," she whispered. "No," I said. "It told the truth." He said yes, not quickly, not carelessly. She said it like a woman who understood exactly what the word meant and chose it anyway. Years later, when people asked how we got together, Renee usually said, "He fixed my fence." I'd say, "She made lunch." Both were true. Neither was the whole truth. The whole truth was that Sydney had looked at peace and called it boring. Renee looked at the same piece and made room for it at her kitchen table. And me? I finally stopped believing that being steady made me easy to leave. Sometimes the person who truly sees you is not the person who had you first. Sometimes love begins with a broken fence, an honest lunch, and someone brave enough to say, without shame, "Stay a little longer." What would you have done if your ex's mother called you to fix her fence, then offered lunch in a way that felt more personal than either of you expected? And have you ever had someone finally value the part of you someone else dismissed?